Good morning, everyone. This is Michele Hughes from Ageless and Timeless. Today is a very special day. I have a guest who's been a good friend of mine for 3 years, and I met him uh, through the longevity world and through a mutual friend, and he was on my podcast in 2023. And his name is Dr. Bill Lawrence. I say Lawrence, but a lot of people say Lawrence. So which do you prefer, Bill?
Either one is just fine.
Okay. Well, one is more French Canadian and the other one is more basic American. So, anyway, Bill, welcome back. It's been an incredible 3 years that I want to fill in the blanks on. And I see you've increased your hair volume since we last talked.
Well, I just haven't had a chance to get a haircut.
To get a haircut. Okay, well, you're
Yeah.
looking great and
Well,
very
thank you.
trim and muscular and all good. So let me just give people a little bit of the backstory that some people that are with us today might not have been with us 3 years ago. And by the way, everybody, this is my 8th year, just celebrated, of hosting Ageless and Timeless. So it's been an incredible journey, and Bill Lawrence is just one of many that but he's one of the very special ones. So I just, all transparency, he has been under the guidance of a Dr. Khavinson, who is unfortunately passed away last year, I guess it was, and he was Bill's mentor, and he was the head of the gerontology lab at St. Petersburg, and he's the one that Putin assigned the role to find a way to help their astronauts and their victims of the Chernobyl and even Olympic athletes to increase their longevity and get over some of their hurdles that they had suffered. So it's the peptide bioregulators is the industry that emerged as a result. And for 40 years in the Soviet Union and Russia, they've been buying these peptides right in a pharmacy. But for the U.S., it's all very new. And we can thank Dr. Bill for bringing the peptide bioregulators to the United States. So once again, Bill, I want to thank you because I've been one of your, quote, victims in your program. And I can only say that, I did my biological versus chronological test with True Diagnostics only, I think, a year ago, and I was about 15 years younger biologically. So we'll see what happens when we do it again next year. But I feel very proud that I've been, and very thankful and grateful that I've been under your guidance all these 3 years, taking the peptide bioregulators and seeing those improvements. So Dr. Bill is an interesting backstory. He was an attorney, a real estate developer like I am, and he, when he realized that his whole family had died very young and he was reaching the age where most of them had reached their mortality, he decided that that was not going to be his fate. And he went and got his PhD in nutritional science, and then he very, very uniquely, because not very many people would ever have the guts to do this, but he found out about Dr. Khavinson, and he actually flew to Russia and he knocked on their door and they took him in and he became their disciple, their protege. And that's how we in the United States have gotten these peptides, bioregulators, which are the oral version of the peptides you're hearing so much about online right now. But I can tell you that these are the authentic peptides that are not being developed in China and sold on Instagram like so many of them these days. So Dr. Bill, welcome back. And I just want to ask you a quick intro question, because I'm sure people who did see you 3 years ago want to know what has changed in your purview of the peptide bioregulator world in the 3 years since we've been together.
Okay, that's a good question. And very little actually has changed in the actual peptide bioregulator world itself. I mean, we're still using the peptides that Professor Khavinson developed over 40 some odd years. We've expanded the clinical study. Well, the quick history, we started the telomere clinical study roughly about 2010 or so. I think that was right. No, 2015, excuse me, yeah. I went to Russia in 2010. So we started a telomere test because telomeres are a good proxy for longevity. And my focus is really the longevity aspect of bioregulators. They're also used for organ regeneration. And in the slideshow that I'm going to present, I touch on that a little bit. But my focus truly is longevity. How can we reverse the biological age of humans, slow it down, and then reverse it? And we can, and we have the proof. The other thing that's changed is that about 2020, I guess, we were able to start doing what we call epigenetic testing, which I'll explain a little bit later into the peptide or into the PowerPoints. So that gave us another proxy to be able to determine biological age. So we can measure people's biological age with these two proxies, one the telomeres and then the epigenetics. What has changed is with, in a sense, all technology transforms, gets better and better, more specific. And so when we started off with the epigenetics, we could just get a biological age for, you call it the gene system. Then it was, we could split it up and get an overall biological age, and we could get a separate biological age of the immune system. And then it transformed after that to we now can get the biological age. And I don't, by the way, I don't like that term biological age, but it's the buzzword that everybody sort of understands. It's much more
Right.
complex. Anyway, we can now get the biological age of 19 organs and systems of a human being. In other words, we can determine, with a variance of a year or two, we can determine the age of your heart, Michele, the age of your brain, your
Mm-hmm.
pancreas, your liver, your kidney, and so forth. And when we get that information, I then prepare a protocol. My assistant and I do a protocol. In fact, here, come in. This since you've talked to Lori from time to
Yeah. Hi,
time, yeah,
Lori.
Hi,
yeah,
So nice
Michele.
to
yeah,
It's a
meet. So
pleasure to
nice
meet
to
you.
nice to
yeah,
finally meet you.
yeah.
You've been extremely competent and helpful. Thank you.
Yes, she certainly is. So we create a protocol, and we now have 21 of these different peptide bioregulators. And so when I get the epigenetic breakdown of these 19 systems, and I see that the heart is accelerated in terms of its biological aging, or the liver or the kidney, then I can build, actually, Lori and I then build that protocol to address that issue. So we'll have kind
Right.
of a standard protocol for longevity itself, and then we
Right.
add the additional ones for anything that is biologically aging quicker. So that's a
Right.
big change that we can be that
Mm-hmm.
specific.
Right, I agree. I totally agree, and I can't wait to be tested in that way because my tests are older and they were just the more generic ones. So, well, I don't want to take away from what is really important today in this presentation, which is that what you did last time 3 years ago, but much upgraded, as you said in your email to me. So why don't you go ahead and take over, and you be the teacher today, and let all of us be your students.
Be happy to do so. Let's bring up the slideshow at this point. What I'm interested in, particularly these days, as a longevity scientist, what I'm really interested in is we see this word longevity tossed around the internet and on YouTubes and so forth. Um, and in fact, when I did a check with YouTubes, there were over 500,000 YouTubes with
Wow.
the title longevity in them. And so about 6 months ago, because I've been in this field for 30 years and then about 11 years with the Russians, I realized that there's a huge amount of confusion in terms of longevity. And what I break it down into in this presentation is going to talk about things that are longevity hopeful, okay? Things that are pertaining to longevity that are just out and out hype, and then the real science. And the real science in terms of longevity interventions is quite small. It's only really about 8 or 9 interventions, as I call them, have any scientific basis. They have, published clinical studies uh, and lab work and so forth. So what I'm doing with this presentation is I'm separating out what's hopeful, what's hype and what's actually science in longevity.
Well, I can tell you that that's very, very compelling and very
Okay,
much
and now,
needed, because there's an awful lot of charlatans out there that, people just don't know that they how they have to separate the hype from the hope from the science, right? So let's dive in. I'm ready. Cellular protection is a key component of longevity, and that's where C60 enters the conversation. Known for its powerful antioxidant properties, C60 is being explored for its role in reducing oxidative stress and supporting cellular resilience. As interest grows around mitochondrial health and aging at the cellular level, C60 continues to stand out as a fascinating area of research and application. It's exactly the kind of forward-looking wellness solution we aim to spotlight on Ageless and Timeless. For more information on C60 and how it's being used in longevity-focused routines, check the affiliate link in the show notes or use Ageless10 for 10% off your purchase of all their products. All right. Well, okay, so I think one of the biggest questions today, Bill, that I get all the time, and I know you can help with this, is what is the difference? And I know what you're gonna say, but let me just ask it anyway. It's rhetorical. What is the difference between peptide bioregulators and injectable peptides that are all over the world right now as one of the hottest new developments in the longevity space?
great question. And there is a big difference. What I call the synthetic or the therapeutic peptides are wonderful. In fact, I'm using several myself, and my belief is that you should use those as well as the bioregulators because they target different things. The synthetic peptides target acute situations, BPC, let's say 157, for instance. If you've got tendon problems, ligament problems, wounds, and so forth, that's where you want to be because it is effective and it's effective in the short term. On the other hand, the bioregulators are things that take quite a bit of time because they're regenerative. In other words, if we are using them, say, for liver support, it's going to take 18 months to 2 years to fully address all of the issues of, say, a 60 or 70-year-old person in terms of their liver. So they're very slow, and it's the bioregulators that will change a person's biological age. The synthetic peptides will not do that, but they are very useful for targeting acute problems. That's why I say you should be using both the acute ones, the synthetics, as well as the bioregulators in a program. The first thing is obvious to everybody, and that is the value of time. And Steve Jobs has made a statement. By the way, are there people who are going to only be able to listen, or is everyone going to see
No.
this?
Everything, well, a couple of the podcasts are still audio only, but we're on every major podcast site, and plus we have our own YouTube channel, and so I would say 80% will be visual.
Okay, then I don't have to spend a lot of time reading things that people can't
No,
see. Okay,
no, and
so
people who go on one that's audio can always switch to another one, knowing that this is going to be a visual.
okay.
So I wouldn't worry about that. I just do your thing.
Great. Okay. So the issue here is the value of time. Steve Jobs said in a statement that it's really clear that the most precious resource we all have is time, and that's absolutely true. Much more valuable than money or fame or anything else is how much healthy time do we have in this world. And then Thomas Edison, many, many years ago, said that time is really the only capital that any human being has and the only thing he can't afford to lose. And what's interesting is that we're seeing billionaires now realizing, of course, this, and they're funding foundations and scientific investigations basically to be able to extend their time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I'm going to go quick through some of these because it's the data that counts. I'm an
Right.
attorney. I'm a scientist. I've been in this field 30 years at this point. What this slide is basically the message is you have to have the evidence if I'm going to look at something, you better bring the evidence. And by evidence, I mean um, published clinical studies, lots of lab results showing before and after. And as we're going to talk about in this field of longevity, it's very light on evidence. That is, there's a lot of claims that are made, but in my world, you better bring the evidence. And I'm a geroscientist, you can say. And what that's all about is that we believe that the root cause of a lot of things like cancer, dementia, cardiovascular disease, and chronic illness really starts with the aging process. And that is, if we can improve the age, the biological aging process, many of these things will be mutated to some degree, reduced, maybe even eliminated. But you've got to start with what we call the root cause, which is just human aging. And we know, of course, that as people age biologically, chronologically, that they become subject to all of these types of diseases. So our focus is let's focus on aging. What's very confusing out there is that we have these terms, lifespan, health span, and biological longevity, and they are oftentimes overlapped and they're confusing to people. What lifespan is, and it's important that we understand going into this presentation the difference between these, because what lifespan is the total years that a person has lived. And we can increase the number of years by enhancing their health span, but lifespan is just how many years are you going to basically live. Health span then is different. Health span is how many years can you live in good health. And I'm going to show some stats in a moment about the difference between lifespan and health span. The focus there is on function, vitality, independence, delaying disease. That's health span, okay? Then the third category, what I'm showing here, is biological longevity interventions, which is basically what I'm doing. And what we're doing is we're targeting the mechanisms of aging, like telomeres and epigenetics and so forth, in order to improve both the lifespan, the health span, and be able to create 15 or 20 years of additional longevity, but in a healthy state. So we have to differentiate between lifespan, health span, and longevity.
Okay, well, that's very helpful, Bill, because everybody talks about lifespan and health span, but very few people ever mention the third, biological longevity interventions, which is really, the probably the most, or is the most important
Well,
aspect of this. So, thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. They're all important, particularly health span, and we're going to see some remarkable statistics that are rather disturbing for Americans. In fact, this slide shows that the Americans have shorter lives than most of the rest of the world. This is a chart showing the average longevity in terms of chronological age of Americans, and the blue is for men, the red is for women. Notice the huge difference between the men, women of America and those in Japan, Switzerland, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. They are 5 to 7 years. They have 5 to 7 more longevity years than the typical American. That is a real statement about where we are as a nation in terms of our health.
And we spend more money than any other country on healthcare.
Absolutely. Yeah, by several times. We per capita, we spend more money than the rest of all the other countries collectively. It's just a real broken system. I'm preaching to the choir with you.
Right,
You understand that. So
right.
anyway, Americans live shorter. Okay.
Yep,
Here's
got
now
it.
here's health span. Okay. Not lifespan. Here's health span. In other words, how long are Americans and others in other countries, how long are they healthy for? How many years are they basically functional versus the years that they're dealing with disease, chronic disease, etc. And notice the United States in this has about 64 years on average, both sexes, 64 years of functional health. And from 64 years onward in America, it's kind of downhill for most people. And if you compare to the other countries, they are typically 5, 6, 7, 8 years longer in health span. In other words, how long they're healthy. And what their situation is like, if we look at Japan, their health span is 73 years. Well, their lifespan is about 10 more years than that. So they have about 8 or 10 years of problematic, challenging health issues. On the other hand, in America, at 64 years of health span, we're looking at 15 to 20 years of dealing with disease.
Wow. Unbelievable.
So what this chart shows is lifespan versus health span in the United States. And so the life expectancy of males in America is 76.5 years, and for women it's 81.4 years. The healthy life expectancy, though, for men is actually 64 years, or 12 years less than their life expectancy. And for women, it's 66 years, or 15 to 16 years in a chronic disease, disability kind of situation. That's a long time for people to be battling with disease at this point.
Right.
And so when we talk about some of these interventions, keep in mind that healthspan is targeting keeping people healthy longer.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, longevity is adding additional years to their normal number of
Mm-hmm.
years that they would have.
Mm-hmm.
But what's disturbing about this is, again, for men, they're 12 to 13 years of their life going to be lived with disease and disability. For the women, 15 to 16 years.
Amazing.
Okay, so I have a different criteria. As I say, I've been in this field for decades, and I spent 10 years with the Russians and so forth. My definition of longevity is a significant extension beyond normal lifespan. Okay, and so the criteria that we use in our clinical studies, we have to be able to change a person's biological age, let's say, by at least 3 out of these 5. Sometimes we look at 4. These are the things that we can do, that we've proved we can do, that the Russians proved it, and so forth. So our criteria is we've got to reduce people's telomere age, as we call it, and we're going to get into more detail, by 20 years. Okay. We
Mm-hmm.
have to change the epigenetic age. This would be generation lab and true diagnostic. We have to change that epigenetic clock. We have to slow it down by at least 7 years, and we're going to show what we do to do that. The epigenetic all-cause mortality risk has to be reduced by 50% in order for it to fit my criteria. We also have this concept of pace of aging that I'm going to spend a little more time talking about. We have to reduce people's pace of aging. And what we have is everybody understands chronological aging, but we're now looking and we can determine what a person's biological rate of aging is. And in our clinical study, our goal is to slow it by 10%. And then we're going to talk about the Hayflick limit for a few minutes at some point. But our criteria is we've got to extend the Hayflick limit by at least 30%. That's my criteria for longevity. Anything less than that tends to be mortality reduction or health span.
So I think you're gonna. I know that you're gonna explain these because most people don't know what the Dunedin and the Hayflick and the Horvath. The
Yes.
other two, yes. I mean, most people know what a telomere is, and epigenetics, of course, is the lifestyle version of your genetics, right? So I'll let you keep going, but those are three that I'm sure people are asking themselves, what are they?
And I'm going to talk about each one of those.
Perfect.
Okay, so what this slide is talking about is longevity hope. That is, we don't have any human longevity evidence, but with animal studies and lab work and so forth, we believe that this is on the horizon. And I know that the first one here, stem cells, is a lot of your expertise. So you know much more about where we are in terms of longevity and stem cells. I place it into the hope category because I don't think we have a huge amount of published clinical studies for longevity. We have a lot of studies using stem cells to treat health span for health issues. Is that a fair
Mm-hmm.
assessment?
Very much so. And a lot of it is experiential. I mean, it's the people, the feedback from the people who feel better. Like, and that's really like the cutting edge is, how do you feel? I mean, the big question. how do you feel? What's the difference? So a lot of this is not done through science, which is often very expensive to do those studies, but it's done more by interviewing the users.
Yes, that's why I call it longevity hope. I hope
Yes.
that all of these, and what we're talking about is NAD therapy, hyperbaric, metformin, senolytics,
Yeah.
rapamycin. These are all things that we hope can be turned into human evidence. And we're going to talk a little bit in a moment about the difference between animal evidence versus human evidence.
Right.
Okay,
Okay.
now at this point, in this grouping, we're basically looking at experimental longevity interventions, things that are still, just as you mentioned, Michele, we don't have, multiple clinical studies, but we have feedback from people, we have lab reports, and the 6 that I've listed here are experimental, and I hope every one of them can be created. So what we call, and I'm going to explain what each one of these is: cellular
Right.
reprogramming, okay, gene therapy, senolytics, stem cells there, immune rejuvenation, and plasma exchange. Those are the things that I consider to be experimental, just because we don't have enough published clinical study with humans to say that, yes, that one is effective for certain. They're in the infancy at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So cellular reprogramming, very, very complicated. What scientists do is they introduce a special set of proteins into our cells. And what they're doing is, you could think of it as you've got your computer hard drive and you bring in a new set of data that you want to load to it, because it'll make it function much better. That's sort of the idea with cellular reprogram. You're changing the biological makeup of cells. It's experimental at this point, but we have some basic sort of preliminary information that this could be workable. We could be able to control by changing the cellular makeup of our cells with certain proteins. So it's very, very hopeful. The idea is to identify older cells, which is possible to do, and turn them into younger cells.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's in the experimental category.
Mm-hmm.
Gene editing, okay, what we call CRISPR and so forth. What we're doing here is, the science world is basically identifying where there are mutations or weaknesses or broken in our DNA, um, uh, what we call mutations, and we're able to kind of identify at that level where there's an issue, where there's something that when the cell was replicating, it didn't replicate perfectly, and so there's a gap, there's a break, and so forth. And the idea with gene editing is that we can go in like with a pair of scissors and cut into that gene area that, along with the chromosomes, and we can pull out a defective piece of it and then reattach it. Very, very experimental at this point, but it
Mm-hmm.
has, possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get to longevity hype, okay? And there's a lot of it out there. I can't tell you, and I'm sure you, Michele, run into this all the time as well, where you click on YouTube and there's a longevity claim made, backed by science, or the 5 supplements for longevity, stem cell renew supplement, all those kinds of claims are made. And that's the hype. And unfortunately, I think that about 90% or more of what's unfortunately, on YouTube and some of these other sites, a lot of it's hype, because there's really no evidence for most of it. It's either in the hope category or it's just out and out hype. And you can identify hype by things like when it has elite endorsements. I think you call them, is it influencers? Is that
Yeah.
what they call them?
Right. That's what they're called particularly on Instagram.
Yeah, okay. Um, so you have an influencer who has, say, a large following on their social media and so forth, and so they come out and they endorse a particular thing, some capsules or supplements or whatever it may be, and of course they're getting paid a percentage for any sales. What they end up saying is, if you purchase and use my name and so forth, you get a 15%, 20% discount. And so people will tend to believe that that's probably, if you've got an important individual, with credentials, doctors, and all the rest of that stuff, scientists, that it's probably a valid thing, and there's probably some science behind it. Unfortunately, it's the rare situation when there's some real science behind it. So you have to be aware of, like, if there's offers, we only have 100 bottles left, or claims that the government is suppressing and so forth. Those are all, I think, signs that you're in probably the hype category.
And it gets
Yeah.
even worse because a lot of people order on Amazon for the convenience, but Amazon mixes all the different people that represent the sell on their site, on their platform, and many of them are charlatans. So, but they're all in this warehouse. So, caution to all people who order supplements on Amazon, because you could be getting something from China that's Chinese people, as we all know, have the amazing ability to imitate. And the bottles look the same. You would think you're buying right from the manufacturer. So that's another area that you didn't put in here, but it is something for people to be aware of.
Yes, very good reminder, Michelle. So this is my supplements in my working area and so forth.
Wow.
I have a lot of hope. Okay. In other words,
Wow.
I do the investigation, and most of these you're not going to find published clinical studies.
Right.
But but they, logically, if you're talking about like vitamin C, vitamin D, and the common things. So I do a lot of capsules. Now it looks like a massive amount. I don't do more than probably 25 or 30 capsules a day. I rotate through not only the peptides, but these nutraceuticals. So over
Right.
the course of the year, my goal is to be able to use these that I think have some, reasonable support in terms of being effective, along with the peptides. I rotate through all of these during the course of a year.
You know,
Some
you
people,
know, Bill, sorry to interrupt you. It would be so valuable once you get to a point where you feel confident about the results. Even if you don't, do this as a major study for the world, at least develop a list of Bill's supplements that work, that are efficacious, and and then give us your source. Like I buy all my stuff on FullScript. Where do you buy yours?
I buy mine from the manufacturers in almost all cases.
Yeah.
The large nutraceutical companies that have been around for a
Yeah.
long time.
Like I assume you don't go to Thorne and Designs for Health and the ones that have
Yeah,
the most science. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway,
yes,
I don't
yeah,
want to hold you
yeah,
up.
yeah.
That's something I think would be an incredible value, Bill. I
I
mean,
hope to keep
really,
that.
everybody's biochemistry is different. So what might work for you might not work for the next person, particularly if that next person is much more toxic than you, and they're taking a supplement, but it's really not getting to where it needs to go because toxicity blockades. But if they do follow the other protocols that we're talking about that you propose and expose here for science based, and then are at a point of being receptive to any of these supplements because their body is more is clean or cleaner. Hard to be totally clean in today's world. But anyway, I think that would be an amazing. So we'll talk about that offline because I think that's something you should look at.
Okay, we will. Just one added thing to keep me busy.
Yeah, right. And I know you're not busy enough, Bill. So,
So now
okay.
this is one of the most important bits of information, this slide. People don't realize this. I think they realize that animals are used, in the labs for these studies and so forth, principally to determine if there are adverse effects, and what they don't realize is that 90 to 95% of the drugs that are processed in a lab and so forth, only about 5% of them work in humans. In other words, 90
Wow.
to 95% of the drugs don't work in humans when you try and transfer them over. And it's
Wow.
kind of it's kind of a quiet secret in unfortunately in the pharmaceutical world and even the nutraceutical world. And so you have to be careful when you're looking at an advertisement, for let's say a nutraceutical. You need to then dig into it and find out when out. And by the way, at the bottom of the slide, all these slides, you're going to see the references, these are published clinical studies. On almost every slide that you're going to see is backed by a published clinical study. That's the attorney in me.
Right,
What you're going to see.
actually that was the question I was just about to ask: is where do you get the proof of that? And now I can see down below on my page here that because I made a copy of your entire show, so I'm looking at the hard copy here, and yeah, I see now that you have references to and those studies are proven. I mean, those are. I mean, because that always begs the question: how do you know the studies are from people who don't have special interests?
Yeah, these are evidence-based published studies, pretty much on every slide that you're going to see. The issue here is that if the failure rate in terms of animal versus human is 95%, and only 5% of it works in humans, most of the time, the claims that people are making, marketing and so forth, they don't tell you this is based on an animal study. They just
That's
say
right.
it's
That's right.
66% effective and 55% effective, yeah, in animals. But it's not true in humans. So you have to be really, really careful.
Thank you for that, Bill.
We'll skip through this kind of quickly. This is what we call the evidence hierarchy. Okay, this is the attorney in me.
Mm-hmm.
We have different levels of what we call evidence. Okay, so the
Mm-hmm.
number one down here is what we call cell studies and animal models, and that is probably where 95% or more of the marketing and the nutraceuticals and various things where they are is that they've either got some cell evidence or they got some animal evidence, and that's the lowest level of what we call evidence. The second one is what we call mechanistic plausibility. In other words, from a biological standpoint, knowing the pathways and so forth, does the intervention make some sense? Like, for instance, if it's lowering blood pressure, do you see an improvement in the arterial system and so forth? Can you measure it and so forth? Does it make sense? The third level is what we call the observational human data. That's where I am with my two clinical studies. Are you running human studies for long enough? Ours are 10 years basically, where you can observe. You may not have a control group, but you can observe, like for instance, Michele, your labs that we were talking about, the generation labs, can you observe information that supports the idea that this intervention is having positive results? It's an observational human data.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with, we've spent $2 million in the last 10 years on our studies, the telomeres and the epigenetics. And we don't have a separate control group because that would increase the cost to like $10 million if you had a group of people who were taking the peptides versus a group of people taking a non-peptide substance. It's
A
very
placebo.
expensive. Yeah,
Right.
very placebo. Yeah, very expensive. Then on top of that, you get interventional human trials. In other words, trials where you actually have a control group. It's a long enough period. Months is nothing. Okay, we're talking about you've got to have years of success with the control group not benefiting and the group in using the intervention are showing success. That takes a long time. It costs a lot of money. And then on top of that, you have to also have the number 5, what we call replication and outcomes. In other words, one clinical study published someplace is not enough. You've got to have independent other clinical studies confirming that original study. And one of the criticisms that are made of the Russians so long is that they haven't had a lot of replication studies outside of Russia. I'm going to show that that's incorrect, but that's the gold standard, is when you have multiple clinical studies confirming the benefit of that particular intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, longevity science. Here we're going to talk about the interventions that actually have science behind them to a
Mm-hmm.
greater or lesser degree. And there's about 9 of them altogether. Mental attitude. And what we're showing, I need to also talk about mortality risk. Because longevity studies, of course, last a long, long time, the lifetime of people. What we do often is we look at the risk reduction, mortality risk reduction of groups of people and assume that that is supporting longevity. And it gets kind of overlapped and a little gray area between when you're talking about mortality risk versus just longevity. But what we know is that these interventions that I'm going to show you here will reduce mortality. And if it's reducing mortality, then you're getting to some extent longevity. Now, it's not as much longevity as my criteria that I've indicated is what I use in the work that I'm doing. But so, for instance, mental attitude. And these, you see the letters and the numbers at the bottom, PMID.
Mm-hmm.
These are the clinical studies published that support all of these. So
Mm-hmm.
mental attitude, 15 to 20% mortality reduction if you just think right about your health. If you
Mm-hmm.
think I'm going to live a long time, I'm healthy and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Really an interesting story. The actor Morgan Freeman was asked a couple of years ago, and I think he's like 89 or 90 at this point, and he's still making movies. And he was asked by somebody uh, something about, how is it that you're so healthy? And his response was, I just don't look the old man in.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I saw
I, I,
I
I
saw that interview. Yeah, that's great.
yeah, I think that's wonderful. That's the mental attitude. I have this mental attitude for
Mm.
most of my life that I don't get sick. I never get
Right,
sick. I haven't had a cold and flu in 40 years.
right,
Maybe a couple of sniffles, but that's it. I've never been inside of a hospital for treatment for me. I haven't
right,
seen a conventional doctor in at least 45 years. Anyway,
right.
then the rest of these are pretty obvious. Sleep, 39% mortality reduction if you're doing proper 7 to 8 hours of sleep and so forth. Saunas, particularly up in the Scandinavian countries,
Mm-hmm.
almost every home up there automatically, if you like in America, if you have an extra bathroom, in Scandinavia, you have a sauna. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
part of their culture.
Right,
40% mortality risk reduction for people who are using a sauna 3 to 4 times a week.
right.
And then we have the blue zone lifestyle. Everyone's heard of the blue zones. Those are certain sections of the world like Sardinia, Okinawa. Actually, one is considered to be in California in the United States, Loma Linda,
That's
where,
right. I was just telling someone that yesterday that we only have one,
yeah,
and it
it's the, what's the, Jehovah's Witnesses? Is that who it is?
yeah, I
Yeah,
can't remember. I was trying to tell this gentleman yesterday what is the name of the like. It's not a Quaker, and it's not. I don't think it's Jehovah's Witness. It's something. There's another practice, a religious practice that they are at Loma. We'll look it up afterwards, Bill. But I
okay.
know I don't think it's Jehovah Witness. I'm pretty sure.
No, you're right. It's not. They're vegetarians. I remember that.
Exactly. That's just what I told him. I said I know they're
Yeah.
vegan or vegetarian, but I can't remember the name. And I meant to look that up this morning. It's so funny that you brought it up, but I will get it for us.
Yeah, and now there's some issues here because the problem was the data gathering. They were looking at these different places like Sardinia, Okinawa, and so forth,
Hmm.
and unfortunately, a lot of them didn't have really good data evidence, like birth certificates and things of that nature. Um, and these are basically kind of small towns. They're actually mostly villages where people have lived in that village for generations, and they've got 3 and 4 generations alive, and and they're close knitted and so forth. And so some of the information was based on people recollecting when grandma or great grandma was born. So we can't rely on it 100%, but there's enough information that indicating that in a blue zone type of lifestyle, and what we know that's a really important part of that is the socialization, the people around you that are going to be around you for your whole life. The 3 generations living in maybe the same home and certainly with in a short distance of each other.
Right.
30 to 50% mortality reduction.
Well,
Okay,
it
then
goes
we're going to,
back to about, the 5 pillars, and
yes,
obviously you're covering those. And a lot of times people miss that fifth pillar, which is, the importance of relationships and connectivity to community and love. I mean, just having love in your life, doesn't always have to be romantic. It can be family love or just the love and passion of being alive, but feeling that connectivity to others. And yeah, so that's a very important one, Bill. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, and unfortunately, because the way we live today in America, it's reflected by the lifespan numbers, the health span numbers that are really kind of, sad compared to the rest of the world because we've lost a lot of this bluestone lifestyle. It's very rare to have various generations when people are older still living together, even in the
Right,
same town.
right.
So then we get to peptide bioregulators, and I'm going to spend a lot more time towards the end of this talking about that. The mortality risk reduction is 33%, and we'll
Hmm.
skip over it for the detail because I'm going to get to it. Then
Okay.
caloric restriction,
Hmm.
significant 10 to 15% reduction.
Hmm.
Exercise, 30 to
Hmm.
45% reduction.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, what this is my wife, wonderful wife, Vess, and I. Married men have a 31% decreased all-cause mortality risk compared to unmarried men.
Wow.
But look at the women. Married women have an 18% decrease all-cause mortality risk compared to unmarried women. In
Mm.
other words, the men have a lot less longevity than the women handling being single, you could say.
So what do
Um,
you think? What do you think is the message out of that?
Oh, the message is women take care of themselves and women have communities. They are much more social than men. That's a lot of it.
Right.
But mostly is that they're just typically that's why I think the gap was what, 7 years between the men and the women in the US. The women lived
Right.
about, yeah, because they just take care of themselves better.
Right.
And
Exactly.
there's also issues like how much stress do men undergo in a lifetime versus women and all that stuff.
Right. And
Um,
lifestyle choices like the food that they choose and the
yes,
alcohol and drug use and so forth, I think is another, those are other factors too. But you're right. The
yes,
overall truth is women are more conscious. Sorry to
yes.
say, but
Yeah. And then on top of that, if you get a dog, you get
yeah.
another 24% reduction in all-cause mortality risk.
Wow. Now that's
Yeah.
an interesting fact I didn't know.
And you can see the clinical study here, the PMID, it's based on a
Right.
clinical study. So, Vess, we've been together 16 plus years at this point. When I was
Wow.
putting this together and showing it to her some months ago, she looked at me and she said, "So, did you marry me as part of your longevity protocol?" And I said, "Of course not, dear, but let's get a dog."
That's great.
Oh, this. Okay. As you can tell, I'm very passionate and devoted, and even obsessed in what Vess says about my longevity and my health. And so I put this one in here because caloric restriction is really powerful. So this is Vess, and this is me taking it my caloric restriction to an extreme, you might say.
Well, I've had Dr. Anton on. He's the intermittent fasting with food. So it's called Prolon Health. And, I told him, hey, I do intermittent fasting because I do it at night because it's so easy. You go to bed, you stop eating at 7 and you don't eat again until 11 the next day. And now you've done your fast. And it doesn't really affect you at all, except maybe those first few hours. But those are the hours that I'm usually doing things like, planning my day, exercising, things that you don't really miss that, first morning thing. So he said, "Oh, Michelle, that's all wrong. You should only do 16 hours max." And so I don't know. What do you feel? What's your number that you use for your intermittent fasting?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a solid gold number. We have different physiologies and so forth. What I
Right.
do, and I don't think it makes too much difference an hour or two, is I start eating at 10 in the morning. I stop at 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
But I also though I stop eating at 5 o'clock on Thursday night, and then I don't have any food until Saturday morning around 9 or 10. So it gives me
Oh.
about a 35 to 36 continuous fasting.
Oh.
And I've done that for years.
Well, I congratulate you. I think it's so hard, particularly when you're active. And but that's why I do the night one because it doesn't affect me at all. But yeah, I congratulate you for doing that one day or 35-hour fast.
Well, I think from my experience, the reason that people have your program is excellent because you're, as you say, as you've identified, there's only a few hours where you might be, people might be eating because you're sleeping so much. If that's a great
Right.
first, I think, initial step for most people, where people, I think, run into problems is all of a sudden they decide, okay, I've got to do this fasting, intermittent fasting thing, and they set out the time and so forth. And after a few days, it just doesn't work for them because they've bitten off too much at this point. So what I tell people is, no, just add 30 minutes or an hour the first week. In other words,
Right.
eliminate and then the second week, two hours, and you'll kind of ease yourself into this. And so for me, the 35 hours or so is simple. I've been doing it for so
Hmm.
long. So
Well, and
don't,
it's become a routine for you. So,
yes,
some things that you do repeatedly, it's the old story about the experiential side that if you keep doing something as it becomes a habit, and then the
absolutely.
habit becomes, you don't even have to think about it. It's just normal behavior. So
Yes.
that's, I think, how it explains what, you've been successful doing the fasting like that because you've just done it for so long. It's,
Yeah, that's true. I weigh today the same as I weighed in high school, and it's a lot of it. And at one point when I was practicing law, I was probably, let me think, 25 pounds heavier at that point.
right.
This is back in the
With
70s.
probably some really bad eating habits too.
Yep, yep. So where we are today is that this slide talks about the billionaires are bankrolling
Hmm.
cell
Right.
rejuvenation. In other words, they've come to realize, as I said earlier, that, and it's kind of a crude way of saying it, they've got more money than they've got time left.
Right.
And as a result, they're funding, in fact, I have a slide here, they're funding all of these, what I call crossing the bridge that I'll talk about in a moment, but all of these interventions like quantum computers, artificial intelligence is already here. CRISPR, that's the cutting, on the genome.
Right.
Gene sequencing, stem cells, replacement organs, all of these things are being funded these days in order to be able to extend their life. And these are some of the companies over here on the right,
Right.
Calico and so forth. The
Yeah.
investment, this slide is a little old. I'm sure the investment now is over 20 to 25
Oh,
billion
for
that they've
sure.
invested.
I mean, Brian Johnson just as an individual says he spends 2 million a year, and then you've got Jeff Bezos and Peter Thiel and David Sinclair. So yeah, there is so much more than 10 billion right now, but I don't know what the number is. But it would be interesting to find that out. I think we should ask Chat GBT that question.
Yes. So this is the longevity bridge, what I call the longevity bridge, and this is dated because I think I put this together about 5 or 6 years ago. The idea here, though, is that if we can stay healthy today, that imagine 10 years from now, what's
Mm-hmm.
going to be available to us in the future. All those
Mm-hmm.
technologies that I just talked about, CRISPR and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
will probably be operational at that point, and we'll be able to take advantage of them. But the
Mm-hmm.
key is you've got to clean up your life. You've got to do all the healthy things that you can do today in order to be around in 5 or 10 more years to take advantage of those things.
Right. Yeah, that's Peter Diamandis was a speaker at A4M 2 years ago, and he said, just don't die in the next 10 years because what we've accomplished in the last 10 years is more than the last 100 years, and the next 10 years is going to be even more compelling. So that was an important message for everybody to take care of yourself or start putting your habits into the right perspective of practice. And well, we've already seen, even though not all of these protocols that you've mentioned are science based yet, we have seen these, amazing developments that, and here's the next slide. I just see it, Lifespan by David Sinclair. So I don't want to steal your thunder, but go ahead.
Not at all. Yeah, I have a lot of respect for Mr. or Dr. Sinclair. He's really a leading um, in this whole longevity health span world. What he's saying here, um, I'll read it for the people. He says, "I have little doubt that cellular reprogramming is the next frontier. All these things and so forth." And then this is the important part. One day, it might be possible to reprogram cells by pills that
Right.
stimulate that stimulate the activity of the OSK factors or the TETs.
Right.
This may be simpler than it sounds. Natural molecules stimulate the TET enzymes, and the TET enzymes are basically a special type of protein. So what
Right.
he's saying is that one day pills are going to come along. There will be
Right.
natural molecules, and I think he wrote the book about 5 or 6 years ago. Well, the interesting thing is these peptide bioregulators that I'm going to talk about in a moment do exactly that. They are natural molecules that stimulate everything in the body. They extend, they drive the telomeres that lengthens the telomeres. They drive the epigenetic age reversal. They're capsules that are basically natural molecules, and we're getting into the detail of that. So he was predicting, and we now have that. So we turn to Russia at this point. As you mentioned in the introduction, yes, I went to Russia 2014 or 15, I think, knocked
Mm-hmm.
on the door. Now, when I say I went there, I got interested in what they were doing when we had Google Translator available. I was seeing some remarkable studies coming out of Russia, and when they were translated. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on, and I realized that with these peptide bioregulators, they're doing amazing things that are unheard of in America. And so I sent a series of emails asking, and they were very gracious, and they said, sure, come on over. I think they were stunned. You know, I would call myself at that point a researcher.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm a scientist now. I don't know. I'm not sure. But they were just stunned that anybody from America would pay any attention to what they're doing in Russia, because I think you, in your opening comments, you indicated there's just very little communication, unfortunately, between the two countries.
Right.
And so they thought, you know, this guy, what is he, what does he want to do? So I showed up, Vess and I showed up. They took us in. All of us just kind of fell into this mutual friendship thing. And Professor Khavinson, who's pictured on the right here, took me in, and he was my mentor until he died. Taught me
Mm-hmm.
everything that I know about peptide bioregulators. Anyway, this is President Putin awarding Professor Khavinson the civilian highest award that they can give for his 40 some odd years of service to the Russian people in the area of health, etc. And he is the one that created this, what we call the mechanisms of peptide regulation of aging. In other words, we can use peptide bioregulators to regulate the aging process, to slow down, and more importantly, or at least as importantly, to be able to reverse a lot of characteristics of aging biologically. I'm going to show you the proof of that. Khavinson's well known all over Europe, hardly known at all here in the United States. He started off in the military many years ago. He was a colonel in the military. He's the author of 700 scientific publications,
Wow.
and just a powerhouse. He was the chairman of every single gerontology association in Europe at one point.
Did he ever get the Nobel Prize for any of his work?
No, he was nominated for it, and then there's a lot of politics in that Nobel Prize. 3 Americans were awarded jointly this is in 2009, they were awarded the Nobel Prize for having, quote, discovered telomerase. That's the enzyme
Yeah,
that is used,
that
okay? Yeah,
Elizabeth, whatever, from San Francisco. Yeah,
yeah, Elizabeth Blackburn and
Blackburn.
yeah, and Greta, I can't remember her name. Anyway, 3 Americans were actually awarded the Nobel Prize for, quote, discovering telomerase. Well, 20 years before, Khavinson discovered it. And when I say Khavinson, he and his institute associates, they not only discovered it, but they were using it 20 years before on human beings. So there was a lot of politics, and Khavinson, you know, was entered as a nominee, but they basically ignored the Russian stuff. So we have a discovery, you know, in a lab by the Americans, and then we have over here a guy that's been using that discovery for 20 plus years on humans, and
Right,
they get the
and
Nobel
they
for
get
that.
the
Anyway,
award. Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Now,
if you
what this,
ask Donald Trump, it's totally politicized, right?
yeah, yeah. So what this shows, Michele, is people say, well, but that's all that Russian stuff. You know, we don't have Well, that's just not true at all. These are the institutions that worked with Khavinson over the years jointly, and so including the National Institute of Aging here in the United States, uh, the Italian National Research Center, the German University of Munich, Spain, Belgium, and so forth. They all work together in terms of the development of this peptide bioregulators in the clinical studies. And then on top of that, these are just some of his 700 studies. These are the ones that are very specific to peptide bioregulators for mortality risk reduction and longevity. And the years 2023, and this goes back to 1982. These are the published studies that he was able to create during all this period of time. A lot of it about telomeres, a lot about longevity.
Very
And then,
interesting.
yeah, and then this is that criticism about, well, but this is just a Russia thing and so forth. It's not true at all. These are publications outside of Russia that confirm what the Russians were doing. So there's what, 6 of these non-Russian publications, clinical studies and so forth. And the one here in 2025 is interesting. It's a British study that was just published 6 months or so ago, independent of the Russians completely, basically creating what we call telomeres. In other words, being able to use a particular peptide to lengthen telomeres. Had no relationship whatsoever, and it's like 2025 versus Khavinson's first discovery was about 1995, I think. Independent, no connection whatsoever between the Russians. Okay, so peptide bioregulators, what are they? They're short chains of 2 to 4 amino acids. They're parts of a protein. Everyone knows what proteins are. We get them from our food primarily, and then some supplements, so forth. But what is also possible, where the peptides come from, is that there's a division made in sort of the biological scientific field in terms of the size of these things. And what we're looking at is chains of amino acids. So if you have a big protein, it's typically 50 amino acids or more, and some of them are like 1,000 on that chain. If you have what we call a peptide, it simply is a protein, but it's a very small chain or collection of whatever the substance is, the amino acids. These peptides come from animals. They're extracted from animals and tissues of animals. And while people think that that's strange today, for the entire history of human beings until probably maybe 150, maybe 200 years ago, medicine as we know it was basically obtained from animals and plants. I mean, that's where the pharmaceutical world started from for hundreds of thousands of years, were animals and plants. And so what Khavinson did was simply go rotate back, you might say, and what they create, the source of these are organs from pigs and calves. And they process them into amino acid chains, and then they put them basically into human beings, either by injection or oral capsules. And what they do is they rejuvenate human organs and systems, literally. And I've seen this so many times, and I'm going to show a couple of slides in the vision field that shows that rejuvenation. They extend telomeres, they activate genes for cellular regeneration, gene expression, DNA methylation. Yeah, let's talk quickly about the Hayflick limit. We could spend an hour just explaining the Hayflick limit. Leonard Hayflick, wonderful scientist, I think at UC Berkeley, I believe. Unfortunately, he died just a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. In the 50s, he figured out, using cell tracking, you might say, that well, let me back up. We're alive today because we have cell replication. All of our cells are replicating all the time over a lifetime. And it's that cell replication that keeps the biologic running, everything is sort of more or less working. But he found that there was only so many divisions of these cells. And after a certain number of divisions, that the telomeres get very short and the cells stop dividing. And at that point, you get what we call senescence, cells that are dying off that can actually be somewhat problematic at times. So the span basically is that most normal human cells can divide about 40 to 60 times. A relook at his materials suggests it could be even as many as 70 times. So we have the ability to replicate those cells about, say, 40, 50, 60 times. In, Important for continuing life, okay? Well, Khavinson figured out and published a study in 2004 that the peptide promotes overcoming of the division limit in human somatic cells. In other words, what he discovered and published is that with these peptides that he could get more cell replication than what was done under the Hayflick limit. And I sent this to Leonard Hayflick about 7, 8 years ago, this study, and unfortunately never heard back from him. I
Wow.
guess he was probably a busy guy.
Mm-hmm.
But this was, this is like Nobel Prize twice of importance. I mean, if you can extend the number
Mm-hmm.
of cell replications, and I think I show it here. Yeah. If you, without getting into all the detail of all this, if you look at the blue line at the top, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's the peptide epitolon. And
Mm-hmm.
what they're showing at the top of the blue is an increase in the cell replications. What they're showing in the darker line that's slanting downward is
Mm-hmm.
the natural slowing down of the replication in human beings. And
Mm-hmm.
what the bar chart is showing here at the bottom, naturally, they have a cell replication in this study of about 54 times, that what we
Mm-hmm.
call doublings. When you add the epitolon peptide bioregulator into it, you get 104 doublings
Mm-hmm.
compared to
Wow.
54.
Wow.
That is remarkable extension of life. And
Wow.
we can't really quantify it in terms of years, but it's somewhere in the magnitude of probably 25 to 30% additional overall cell replication. And not only does that support longevity, but if you have new cells being replicated all the time, you're starting off with, brand new, infancy kind of cells that are healthy. So you're
Mm-hmm.
continuing to feed your replication instead of using the cell replication of say 50 times and those start to peter out. You're getting constantly a lot more of these new cells.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel there's a difference between taking them orally and injecting Epidolon?
Do I feel it or do I know if
No, no,
there's
I
a
mean, do
difference?
you believe that there is a difference? Because some people are injecting, and others like me are using your product, the Epidolon that you provide. Do you
Yeah.
feel there's any difference in the outcome?
There's a slight difference. Khavinson did a clinical study, a published clinical study probably 20 years ago, where he was comparing the injectable epitolon, okay, to the synthetic epitalamin is the
Yeah. I was wondering about the
injection.
pronunciation, Bill, too, because I had always heard epitalon, but then when you said epidolon, I said I guess I better say it right the way Bill does. So which way is the right way?
Well, there's no right way. It's just, it's that tomato kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway,
Okay.
to answer your question, we in the clinical study we use the oral capsules. Okay, in Russia they use mostly the injections. Khavinson did a telomere study 20 some odd years ago to compare the two in terms of how much telomeres would be activated, the enzyme, and what the result would be in terms of telomere length. The difference between using the injectable, and this was like a 5-year study, I think, the difference between using the injectable, okay, versus the oral capsules was 8%
Oh,
in terms of length. So the answer is, yeah, small difference.
right.
But most people would prefer to take the capsules than be injected. And these are
It's,
not the sub-Q these are intermuscular injections with an
oh,
inch and a half,
so
kind of thing.
they hurt more.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Okay, so um, another published clinical study in 2003, peptides of the pineal gland and thymus prolong human life. This is dramatic because we're looking at a period of time of up to 12 years, the study ran. We're looking at mortality reduction, which is kind of a proxy for longevity, people living longer. And what he did was he had several groups of older people broken down by age, and he then had a control group not using the peptides, and then he had a group just using the peptides. And this chart here that I created, he had this group called elderly people, age 60 to 74. They were the
Mm-hmm.
control people, just what we call using polyvitamins,
Mm-hmm.
just regular things that you would have.
Right.
And if we go down to the mortality rate in the course of 12 years, right in the middle of that, okay, if we look at the results over 12 years, 44% of the people in the control group, the non-peptide group, had died, okay?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the next column over, the administration of the pineal gland, in other words, one peptide, the pineal gland peptide,
Mm-hmm.
look at the death rate. It's half of that of the
Mm.
control group. It's 22%. In other words,
Wow.
using over a period of 12 years, the peptide reduced the death rate or the mortality rate by 50%.
Wow.
I don't know of anything out there that will do that.
And how
And
often
these are
in
not,
that
yeah,
study, Bill, how often did if they were using the Epidolon, how often did they have to take it throughout that year in order to have that kind of outcome?
they only took the peptide for the first 3 years in the 12-year study, first three
Oh.
years, and only a limited amount, maybe let's just say monthly for maybe 10 or 15 days,
Mm-hmm.
but only the first 3 years, and then no further use of the peptide for the
Oh,
next 9 years.
that's staggering.
Yeah, it talks to the fact that these peptides were able to regenerate the organs and the systems such that when they regenerated them, let's say in year 3 or 4, then for umpteen years later, this is the death reduction, half. Now let's go to
Mm-hmm.
the next group, the group I'm in. They call it the old people. The Russians aren't the most diplomatic people.
That's pretty discouraging because you're not old. But anyway, they have
Yeah,
to come up
well,
with a different name.
yeah, well, that's the Russians. I mean, I love those people, but yeah, they're just sometimes not as diplomatic as you might be.
Not diplomatic, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so old
So,
people, yeah,
yeah,
75 to 89.
yeah. And I'm in the middle of that group. I'm going to be 80 in a few weeks. So they had then a control group, again, polyvitamins. And during that, looking at the bottom, the course of 6 years, it was a shorter study, of course, because the people were older. So in the course of 6 years, the control group, non-peptide, 82% of those people died, 81.8. Okay. Normal for that part of the world. This is the Ukraine and Russia,
Mhm.
normally for the age bracket. Now, go to the next column over, pineal gland peptide. That group, just using the pineal peptide, cut the mortality rate down to 46%, 45.8%, from 82% to basically 46%. Then
Wow,
he added a second peptide, a thymus peptide, to
right.
another group where they were taking both the pineal and the thymus, and it dropped the mortality rate to 33% from
Wow.
82%.
So in this study, they didn't use the Epidolon. They're just using the two most popular of the bioregulators that you and I have talked about before, is the thymus and the pineal.
Mm-hmm.
And they, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder what would have happened if they had the Epidolon in there as well, given the the staggering statistics about the use of Epidolon.
Yeah, but they're comparable. They're both pineal gland
Oh,
targeted,
I
you,
get
you
it.
might
Okay,
say. Yeah.
all right,
Um, the message here is using just two peptides, and these are the
right,
foundational peptides in our program.
right.
Using just these two peptides, and again, this is a 6-year study, but these people only use the peptides for the first 2 years.
I know that's
That you
amazing.
that you went from 82% to 33% with two peptides. Now, the interesting thing is today we have 21 of these peptides,
Right.
not just two. We have peptides for every major organ. I'll show you a list in a
It
moment.
says
So
22 natural peptide bioregulator extracts
yeah,
manufactured in Norway.
there's one of them that's kind of quasi. So sometimes we'll say there's 21 and sometimes 22.
Okay.
Okay. So in fact, these are the peptides at
Mm-hmm.
this point. Natural extracts from Norway.
Mm-hmm.
So there's brain, heart, uh, bladder, pineal gland, adrenal
Mm-hmm.
gland, muscle, prostate, kidney, stomach,
Mm-hmm.
testes, thyroid. In other words, basically the major organs, there is a peptide that is available.
Right.
Now, the question is this, people get confused. There's a difference between bioregulators and the synthetic peptides that are very, very popular these days.
Right.
Uh, the bioregulators are targeting organs to do regeneration, and they're natural extracts, okay? And they have long-lasting permanent results, but it takes a couple of years before you start to see any results at all.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the thyroid is the one that we see maybe in 8 or 9 months, looking at lab results before and after, that we start to see the needle moving. But
Mm-hmm.
most of these peptides require a minimum of a year. We can typically, with the pineal gland peptides, we can move the telomere markers by a significant amount in the first year, a lot more in the second year. But the other organs, because what we're doing is regenerating an organ. I mean, think about that. We're regenerating a heart, a brain, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Those take 3 to 4 years. We start to see improvement usually about year 2 on those other organs. On the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, since you know a lot about the synthetics, they're lab synthesized, they're very
Mm-hmm.
quick, and they have short-term results. And so we're talking about things like BPC 157, TB 500, and so forth. And of course, the whole new GPL ones that are just wonderful kinds of things. What people are not understanding is that some of the, like retatrutide, the most recent one, not only they think of it as a weight loss intervention, it is that, but the clinical studies are showing significant and benefits to other organs, like for
Right.
instance, kidneys and
Right.
liver. Okay, um,
Right.
visual fat is disappearing at the same time that the other fat is disappearing, and
Right.
so these are used together as far as I'm concerned, and we're kind of getting to that point where people are realizing that they're both helpful. I use a number of these synthetic peptides myself, and so marrying the bioregulators for long term with the synthetics for short term is a wonderful, wonderful protocol.
Well, I'm so glad I asked that question in the beginning because that is probably the $64,000 question people keep, repeating because they don't know, and most people do not know about peptide bioregulators, but they do know about the synthetics. So the fact that you've just explained and people now can understand if they want the longer term effects of the improvements and the organ regeneration, it's the peptide bioregulators, but they are synergistic with the synthetics,
Yes,
with the
absolutely.
injector. Okay.
The
Bill,
best,
we are
yeah,
running out of time. I think Tony has been very generous in letting us stay over. And so I'm thinking that maybe we need to, I hate to do this to you, but I'm thinking that we may need to wrap up. Is
sure.
there any way that you can summarize these last ones in a couple of minutes?
Let's see where we were going to go. This is, let me talk about this and then we'll wrap it up. We
Okay.
talk about organ regeneration. What this slide shows is the before and after with respect to vision
Yes.
issue,
And,
like
and by the
ret
way, Bill, that's where David Sinclair got the most amazing funding. They're
yeah,
working on the glaucoma, which is so this is very appropriate that you brought this slide, added
yeah.
this slide.
Russians have been doing this. I mean, where you see the yellow and the black and the red and so on, that means impaired vision. Green means that you have some vision. So when you look at this first one, the diabetic retinopathy, the patient came in with what you see on the left, all the red and the yellow. 2 years later, their green indicates that they're back to pretty normal vision. Same is true
Hmm.
with macular degeneration. Same is true with retinitis pigmentosa. They've been doing this day in and day out for 20 years. They have a special lab just for vision. So let's end this right there, I think,
Yeah.
because now we're getting into the biological age reversal. We can maybe pick this up at a later time.
I think that's a great idea. And I just wanted to have a moment to tell people about your clinical trials and that there is a possibility if anyone is interested. And I know from our last time 3 years ago, we had so many people contact me about the being in your clinical trials. So could you just give us a quick expose on that and how, and then I'll tell them how they can get involved and connect with you.
Sure. We have, I don't know, 150 plus or minus people, primarily physicians and healthcare people, but some, who are not, but people are just passionate about their health in our study. And we ask people to stay in the study voluntarily for 3 to 4 years because it takes that long to get to those criteria that I showed you earlier. And it involves, it's not very difficult. It involves taking probably 2 capsules a day for maybe 4 or 5 different peptides, say the kidney, the liver, the brain, but typically only 10 days out of the month, and then you're off everything for 20. Unlike pharmaceuticals where you're on them for life,
Right.
it's a very different kind of approach. And what we do is we do some initial lab testing for telomeres and epigenetics, and we get those numbers in terms of they will show us your biological age based on telomeres and epigenetics. And we then look at any other health issues. I'm not a doctor, so I can't treat those, but I can I can't ignore them. So when we have a person coming in who has a health issue, we create a protocol to deal with the lab results, the biological age results, the pace of aging, and then any health issues. And we then build them a protocol that's unique to them for the next 12 months of the peptides that would be appropriate. Typically, it's about 3 to 5 different peptides a month. So we rotate multiple times during that 12 months. And then at the end of 3 or 4 years, pretty much everybody gets to their goals. Naively, Khavinson and I thought that it would only last 3 to 4 years. The problem is when people get to the 3rd and 4th year and we've hit the goals, they don't want to leave. So we've
That's right.
developed we developed a little maintenance program. Anyway, that's the background.
And because you're so busy, we really do not want. We really encourage people to contact me first, and then I will make all the arrangements for connecting with you. But my just so people know, my phone number, the best way to reach me is by text or cell call, and that's area code 808-639-0904. And while it's an 808 area code, I spent many years developing real estate in Hawaii, and I never gave up that number. So, but I do live in the Bay Area, so it's a Pacific time zone if you're going to call me. So, Bill, I'm going to say goodbye because I don't want to overreach with my wonderful producer, but we have had so much information today. I hope people have taken notes when they watch this, or will take notes when they watch this, I should say. And we will schedule again. And so let's just say we stopped at peptide bioregulators, biological age reversal. And what do we need? Like another hour to do the rest, or?
No, I'd say 40 minutes, 30 minutes,
Okay,
40
good.
minutes.
Okay, well then we usually allocate 50 minutes, and then the other 10 minutes, I'll ask you some more questions if that's okay.
That's great. One
So,
last thing I want to say. I purposely am difficult to contact directly. I never give
right.
out my information
I
at
know.
conventions, all that stuff. So you must go through Michele.
That's
Otherwise, you
right.
will not reach me. She's going to be the person that sort of does a little screening to make sure that you understand the program, and then
Right.
she then contacts me.
And I do want people to know that this is not one of those complementary scientific studies out of the government that this is, Bill's time is extraordinarily valuable, and this is an expensive study to be in the clinical trial. So I'll talk about that with anyone that's interested. And there is a difference between a medical professional and a general consumer in terms of the pricing. So we'll go over that. If you are interested, then just please feel free to call me. Okay, Bill, thank you so much for being our guest today again. And now we know we're going to have a round 3. I just have to find a time for you because, like you, we're booked until 2027 right now. So that's a good news for
Whoa,
us. But
that's great.
I just am so grateful to you and all that you're doing for people and their well-being. So you take care and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.